In the early 1900s, New York City was the beating heart of America's Industrial Revolution. The skyline was growing higher, the factories busier, and immigrants from all over the world were arriving in search of a better life. But beneath this golden dream lay a darker truth: long hours, miserable working conditions, and the exploitation of the poor, especially young immigrant women. The garment industry was booming. Fashion in America depended heavily on the sweat of hundreds of thousands of workers packed into small, dusty lofts. Among them was one of the most famous and profitable companies of its time, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. It was located on the top 3 floors, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of the Ash Building near Washington Square in Manhattan. The company was owned by 2 men, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, both immigrants from Russia. They had built a successful business producing stylish blouses known as shirtwaists, popular among young working women of the era. On paper, the Triangle Factory symbolized the American dream, but inside its walls, the reality was suffocating. Nearly 500 workers, mostly teenage girls and young women from Jewish and Italian immigrant families, toiled there. Their wages were meager, about $6 to $12 a week, and they worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The rooms were overcrowded, filled with rows of sewing machines. The air was thick with lint, dust, and the constant whirring of needles. Fire safety was an afterthought. Piles of fabric scraps lined the floors. Exits were few, and doors were often locked to prevent workers from leaving early or stealing material. Complaints were ignored. Workers who protested or joined unions were threatened with dismissal. Yet, these women were determined. They were the backbone of the early labor movement, and they had already participated in strikes, like the famous uprising of the 20,000 in 1909, demanding fair wages and safer workplaces. The Triangle factory owners had reluctantly made some concessions, but changed very little inside the factory itself. And then came Saturday, March 25, 1911, a day that began like any other. The building buzzed with activity. It was a weekend, and around 500 workers were finishing the week's production. Many were chatting, laughing, and folding the last batches of shirtwaists. The smell of fabric and machine oil hung in the air. The clock ticked toward 4:45 p.m., almost closing time. Suddenly, a worker on the 8th floor noticed something, a small flicker of flame under a cutting table. It started near a pile of fabric scraps. Someone screamed. Within seconds, that little spark became a raging fire. The flames fed hungrily on cotton, tissue paper patterns, and cloth trimmings. A shout went up, "Fire! Fire!" and panic spread like lightning. The fire alarm was not directly connected to the fire department. There were no sprinklers, no proper fire hoses, only a few buckets of water. Within minutes, the 8th floor was engulfed in smoke and flames. Workers scrambled toward the exits, but confusion reigned. The stairway doors, especially on the Washington Place side, were locked from the outside. The only open door led to a narrow staircase that quickly filled with smoke. On the 9th floor, workers didn't even know a fire had broken out until they saw smoke billowing through the elevator shafts. Some rushed to windows. Some tried to use the elevator, which made a few heroic trips up and down before the heat warped the cables and stopped it completely. The screams echoed through the building. In a matter of minutes, the factory turned into a fiery prison. The flames rose to the 10th floor, where the company's owners and a few executives worked. They managed to reach the roof and escaped across to the nearby New York University building. But the girls below were trapped. Some tried to use the fire escape, a narrow, flimsy iron structure attached to the building's exterior. Under the weight and chaos, it soon twisted and collapsed, sending terrified workers crashing to their deaths. As the fire intensified, the heat shattered windows. Smoke choked the air. Dozens of women, desperate to escape, climbed onto the window ledges. Crowds gathered on the street below, horrified. Then, one by one, young women began to jump. They held hands, leapt together, their clothes ablaze, falling to their deaths on the pavement. The sound of their bodies hitting the ground echoed through the streets of Manhattan. In less than 20 minutes, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was consumed by fire. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. Their ladders reached only the 6th floor, 2 stories below the flames. The nets they held tore under the impact of falling bodies. There was little they could do but watch in despair as the factory burned. When the firefighters finally arrived, the entire building was wrapped in smoke and flame. They were among the best-trained fire crews in New York, but they faced an impossible task. Their ladders could only reach the 6th floor, while the fire raged on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. As they craned their heads upward, they saw the horror unfolding above. Women leaning out of windows, screaming for help, their hair and clothes burning. The crowd below, hundreds of New Yorkers, could only look on in helpless disbelief. Firemen spread nets on the ground, but the falling bodies tore straight through them. The impact of a single human body falling from that height broke the nets apart like tissue paper. The sound was haunting, a sickening thud, followed by gasps from the crowd. People began to faint, others sobbed or turned away. It was not just a fire anymore. It was a public nightmare playing out in the heart of Manhattan. Inside the building, chaos reigned. On the 9th floor, many workers had tried to reach the elevators. One of the operators, Joseph Zito, became a silent hero that day. He made 3 trips up and down through the smoke, rescuing as many women as he could before the flames warped the elevator cables. On his final descent, women were jumping into the shaft, desperate to escape the fire. When the elevator reached the ground, their bodies fell on top of the cab with a heavy crash. Zito couldn't do more. He had to flee for his own life. Another small group tried the Washington Place stairway, only to find the door locked. They beat against it, screamed and pushed, but the heavy iron door would not move. The factory owners had locked it from the outside to prevent theft and unsanctioned breaks. That decision would become one of the most infamous examples of corporate negligence in history. On the Green Street side, a few workers managed to find another stairway. They descended through smoke and flames, covering their mouths with cloth, stumbling down step by step. Some made it to the street alive, coughing and burned, but alive. Others never reached the bottom. Meanwhile, on the 10th floor, the company's executives and a few cutters realized the fire had reached them. Flames licked through the floorboards and smoke poured in. But there was one chance, the roof. They climbed a small staircase, forcing open the door to the open air. From there, they saw the adjoining New York University building, only a few feet away. Students and professors rushed to help, stretching wooden ladders across the gap. One by one, the survivors crossed the ladders to safety, trembling but alive. The owners, Blank and Harris, escaped this way too, unharmed. Down below, the crowd's horror grew unbearable. Witnesses described seeing young girls at the windows, clutching one another, praying. Some refused to jump until flames touched their backs. A few jumped holding hands, falling together. Others tried to use rolls of fabric as makeshift ropes, sliding down until the fabric tore and they fell. In less